That was not the case a few years ago when decks were primarily built and designed to resist gravity loads, downward forces, in other words, and all the other directions were ignored. But that has since changed dramatically as a result of having so many accidents with decks over the years in various parts of the country. So now decks are designed to withstand forces in all directions. Forces are gravity forces, of course, that's a given, wind forces, lateral forces, anything like that that might cause the deck to move or be torn off the wall or whatever might happen to it. Needs to resist it to a certain point. Now, the best deck you can build adjacent to a single family house is a freestanding deck. In other words, a deck that's not attached to the building at all. That's the primary safest thing to do when you're building a deck, but a lot of people don't do that when they design decks, especially, and this happens in new construction today, they attach them to the house, and that's okay, but it has to be done in a specific way. Okay, so we got to worry about gravity loads, we got to worry about uplift loads, and we've got to worry about lateral loads or back and forth, left and right loads. And if you have any hesitation about some of the things I'm going to talk about tonight, everything I got was from the North American Deck and Rail Association, NADRA. They have a lot to say with codes as far as how decks should be safely built and some of the requirements and restrictions that they allow. So basic definitions: a deck is an exterior floor system supported on at least two opposing sides by an adjoining structure. Now that's a little bit different from a cantilevered deck, which is usually only supported on one side. A typical deck is going to be supported on at least two sides or more. Balcony is an exterior floor projecting from a support by a structure without additional independent supports. And a lanai is a term coined in Hawaii that drifted east to become a term for an open roofed patio, probably from the island of Lanai. And it's pretty commonly used here in the state, especially around the coast. Okay, so we have a load path we have to deal with when we're designing or building a deck. We have a load path to consider, to imagine in our minds, and that's going to be the attachment to the building, and then whatever's sticking out away from the building, that has to be supported some way, and then everything has to be tied together so it doesn't come apart as a result of wind or any kind of forces working on it. Probably the most important connection is going to be the building connection, or where the deck connects to the wall with a ledger board typically. How that ledger board is installed is very important. You're going to run across decks in your travels where the ledger board is only nailed on, perhaps with 16 penny nails. That's no longer allowed because the nails will pull out. You're going to see ledger boards with no flashing on them, which is going to be a red flag as to whether or not there's going to be wall damage on the opposite side of that ledger board. Things to be looking for. Here's what a typical ledger board should look like. This is not written in stone. There are going to be variations of this, but basically the ledger board should be bolted, not nailed. There should be flashing on top of the ledger board, so any water running down the wall is taken away from the ledger and not falling behind it. And of course, you can't be using ledger strips anymore. Those 2x2 pieces of wood where they would notch the joists and sit it on the ledger, you can't be doing that anymore because that's allowing the nails of the ledger, or more accurately, the nails of the 2x2 to support the load of the deck, and that's not what a nail is designed to do. A nail is designed to hold pieces of wood together, not carry loads. And if you keep that thought in your mind when you're looking, it's going to open your eyes to a lot of things that might be wrong when you're inspecting a deck.
Mike, this is Fred. May I ask a question?
That's up to the boss.
Go ahead, Fred. Go ahead, Fred.
It shows the house building felt terminated behind the deck flashing, but I think it should have been terminated over the deck flashing so that the water is drained out over that flashing.
Yes, you're right. This is just for example. They're not really concerned about the felt or the sheathing. They're more concerned about the ledger, picturing the ledger and the flashing on top, and the joists, of course, too.
Okay, great, thanks.
Joist hangers. But you're right. Yeah, everything should be on top of itself in order to encourage water to get away from the building. So what's acceptable when it comes to fasteners? You're going to see all of these things out there. That doesn't mean they're properly used. And that's going to be determined by your local building official, whatever they decide they're going to accept. Now, if they're following the NADRA requirements or any of the older deck building requirements that were around before NADRA came out with their own, you're going to find they only accept two. They only accept lag bolts and machine bolts. None of these others are acceptable. Now, I've seen stove bolts all the time in some ledger boards, but that's from the old days. You don't see them anymore. And all of these lag bolts, machine bolts, any kind of attachment that they're using should have a washer around it to distribute the load of what the lag bolt or the machine bolt is carrying. So you want to look for those as well. Here's an example of a 1924 deck. It's just still standing. And if you look at it closely, you're going to see that's on a ledger board. It's on a 2x4. Those joists are sitting on a 2x4, which are just nailed to the wall. And what's really supporting that deck is these two diagonal outriggers on each end. And that's what's caused it to survive so many years. But it's still shocking to see and would never be allowed today by our standards. And it's amazing that it's still up and running. Joist hangers. There are different size joist hangers, and the proper way to determine whether they're using the right size or not is this. NADRA says that the hanger should encompass at least 2/3 of the width of the joist, the width being the up and down dimension. And that's looks like it's slightly over half. So I would call these out as being under supportive. And the reason is because different size joist hangers have different carrying capacities. And if you're trying to carry a large load on an undersized joist hanger, you're going to end up with issues. And you notice that the ledger board is actually nailed. This is more likely what you might want to see. It doesn't have to go full depth. Like I said, it only has to go 2/3 of the depth. It can be more, but it should never be less than that. This is a good quality one right here. Good size joist hangers, proper bolting. Good job. And they've noticed they've staggered the bolts, which is the proper way to do it. Now, if you want to really be specific about it, I don't get this detailed, but they should be at least 1.5 inches, 2 inches down from the top edge or up from the bottom edge and staggered diagonally as you see here. Typical bolt used. Nails. And look at the size of the joist hangers. They're not quite getting it done. At least there's flashing there. That's usually missing all the time, so it's good to see that.
Looks like some of the nails were rusty too.
Yeah. Well, they look like, if you look, they look like they've been pneumatically nailed. They've been shot in, which means they're not galvanized.
Hey, Mike.
Yeah.
Regarding NADRA, what about the newer structural wood screws?
Well, I tried to look them up because when you talk to Simpson Strong Tie, they say these are acceptable and usable, but I can't, as far as NADRA is concerned, I haven't found anything in their literature that says that. So I'm on the fence about it until I get a definitive answer from anybody. Ledger board nailed, substantially nailed, but still not considered appropriate. Good quality, good size joist anchors, and everything else looks nice and clean. But the ledger board suspect. Notch joists on a 2x2. Now the rule of thumb for this is when you nail the 2x2 to whatever you're nailing it to, Hopefully it's a ledger board, but it may not. It may be just to the siding of the building. The nail is supposed to fall underneath the joist. And you can see here where that's not the case. Again, they're using the nail as a bearing point. Nails are not designed to carry a load. They're only designed to hold things together. So this is no longer appropriate, but this process was used for over 25 years back in the 50s and 60s when they were building decks. And of course, there's no uplift resistance. If a wind comes up, it's going to blow those joists right off there. Here's a joist, I'm sorry, a ledger board attached to the overhang of the roof, which is a no-no by any means. Not a lot holding that in place. You want to look closely, make sure it's done right, which in this case it isn't. They've nailed on the outside, so they're using the nails as the bearing points. Can't do that. Very commonly done 50 years ago, and those decks are still around. Same thing here. This is what happens when it's not done properly. And again, it's the ledger board. Typically, that's the most important connection point, and also the point where a deck usually fails because it's improperly done, or they didn't use proper flashing, water got in behind there, rotted out the band joists, and the deck fell down eventually with a load on it usually. In 2004, Chicago, there was a serious deck accident that caused 12 deaths and over 50 injuries. Deck collapse due to undersized joists, inadequate connections to the building, and being oversized for its use. The 3-story deck was a 10-foot by 17-foot deck, not a big one, and built in 1998. Decks, by the way, are one of the most accident and collapse-prone structures on a building. It had been inspected annually the previous 5 years by the municipal inspectors. Unfortunately, they weren't trained on what to look for, and it got overlooked. Of that deck collapse, 3 high school students, 18 years old each, died. A college graduate and football star, 21 years old, died. Lake Forest nurse, 22 years old, died. Law school student, 24 years old, died. More than 50 were injured at various ages, some seriously, but with most in their lives still ahead of them. Okay, now we're on the outside of the deck. Again, the definition of a deck is it's supported on at least 2 sides. There's our second side right there. It's going to be on a beam usually, supported by a 4x-somethings, and deck should always have a footer under them, not just a flat slab. There should be a footer because there's a load involved. Here's an unusual deck I inspected years ago. That's termite damage in the circles. But see how they've connected everything here? I'm not sure what they're trying to accomplish by doing this rather than running the 4x4s vertically, but it was beyond the scope of my understanding about whether or not this was acceptable or not. So I wrote it up as having to be reviewed by someone with a higher pay grade than I had. No nails. Well, a couple nails here. No nails. No uplift resistance. No uplift resistance. No uplift resistance and leaning. That's lateral forces causing that to lean. Lateral forces. Same thing here. Lateral forces. And the continuous load path, of course, should be from the wall, across the deck, down the 4xs, and sitting on a pad with a footer under it. Decks are designed to carry 40 pounds a square foot, typically, as designed. And that number comes from the fact that they expect people standing on the deck to be evenly distributed, which I think is faulty thinking, because what people like to do is gather at the rail. So that concentrates the load on the outer part of the deck, not at the wall end. They come out here with their cocktails, they watch the sunset, they talk, they socialize. This is reality. So that's no longer 40 pounds per square foot over there. That's probably double or triple that. The deck should be designed to anticipate that kind of load. Diagonal bracing handles a lot of the lateral forces. Look for that and make sure it's in the right location when you're inspecting. Flashing should be put in, but it should be tucked underneath the siding, not put on top of the siding. So this is not functional. This is a balcony coming out of a bedroom with sliding glass doors, and this is a pool right here on the outside of this balcony. So it overlooks the pool. And they've got this big gap right here with a railing that you can climb on because it's a ladder. And what happens when people are living in this house and they have kids? Don't put yourself in that position. Cover yourself. Any questions? Any more questions? Thank you.